Another week, another set of NHL Power Rankings, 6 weeks into the season, as we are getting dangerously close to that infamous US Thanksgiving cutoff where, historically, something like 75% of the teams that are in a playoff spot come Thursday will make the playoffs. So at the very least, if you're a fan of one of these top 10 teams, you're feeling pretty good and liking those odds. And this week, although there are only 2 new teams on this list that weren't on it last week, there has, for the first time in a while now, actually been some movement up at the top. Of course, though, as always, we start from the bottom and move our way up, starting with a couple of honorable mentions, the first of which is the Carolina Hurricanes, who fall right back into this honorable mention category out of the top 10. And honestly, I could have just not said anything here, but this is a team that just continues to perplex me. I don't really know what to do with them, and it seems like they don't know what to do with themselves, as they'll look good one night, then terrible the next, then good the game after that. So eventually, I keep expecting them to have a little bit more consistency and get things figured out and be the top 5 team that I thought they were going to be coming into the season. But so far, we just haven't really seen that. They've still been winning enough games to at least keep themselves on the fringes of this top 10. But for right now, they're not quite inside of it. And my second honorable mention this week is a team that was in the same spot last week in the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, the Maple Leafs did win both of their games this week over in Sweden against Detroit and Minnesota, but in the end, it came down to them and another team with an identical record for that 10th spot on the list. And although it was really splitting hairs, I went with the one between the two that I felt had the better overall stats at this point in time. So then, in that 10th spot, I have the Winnipeg Jets. It really does, at least for now anyway, seem like the Jets have gotten things figured out, having won 6 of their last 7 games all in regulation, including all 3 games this week, with a 6-3 win over the Devils, then winning 3-2 over the Sabres, and a 5-2 win over Arizona. But they're not finding this success in the same way that I would think a lot of people would have expected them to if they were going to find it. That being Hellebuck really carrying the majority of the load, doing a lot of the work, keeping them in games so that they can eventually outscore the opponent. Obviously, that's how you win games, but the point is, I think a lot of people would have expected that if the Jets were going to win games, it would be Hellebuck carrying them to a lot of those wins. Instead, he's been average to even below average to this point in the season, and the Jets have been doing it through being one of the best defensive teams by expected goals to this point, which does make Hellebuck's job a little bit easier and means that he doesn't have to be the lights-out goaltender to carry them that he has been in the past. But even aside from that, they are scoring a lot of goals at the other end of the ice, currently sitting now 5th in the NHL in goals for per game, which is also helped out by the now league-leading 14 goals of Kyle Connor. Plus, they're also getting good contributions from Scheifele, whose 15 assists have him also over 20 points on the season to this point. Now, it is true that the Jets have had issues over the last few seasons maintaining these hot stretches that they have from time to time and carrying that into consistent good play over the course of an entire season, so that will just remain to be seen over the course of the rest of this season. But it does seem like it's at least a good sign for the Jets that they're finding new ways to win these games rather than just relying on Hellebuck to be good. So if they can continue to play at least close to as well as they are right now in front of Hellebuck, when he gets, you would think, eventually things turned around and a little bit closer to his average, then this is a team that should be able to find a little bit more of that consistent production and points in the standings. Up next in the 9th spot, and thankfully not making me look stupid for putting them in the top 10 last week, I have the DC Capitals, who are still not getting the goal production from Ovechkin that you would have expected, with just 5 goals for him in 15 games on pace for somewhere around 27 on the season. But it seems like they decided that if Ovechkin wasn't going to score, they would shift their attention to winning. And that seems to be working just fine as they continue to do that, winning both of their games this week, shutting out the Golden Knights 3-0, and then squeaking out a win 4-3 over the Blue Jackets, which might not be the most impressive win, but it's still 2 points in the standings. Now, admittedly for the Capitals, it is pretty much just the results that get them into this top 10, as their way of getting these results has not been the prettiest. They're below league average in just about every major category: goals for per game, goals against per game, expected goals both for and against. So there's a possibility that this is just a bit of a hot patch for them, and things might start to fall apart here in, well, sometime in the next month or two, especially if Ovechkin doesn't start scoring a little bit more than he has been. But at least for right now anyway, the Capitals are winning enough games to rack up some points, and if they continue to do that, even if they're still around 500 the rest of the way, they could very well end up in the playoffs, and once there, who knows? In the 8th spot, and moving down one from last week, I have the Florida Panthers. Now, the Panthers mostly moved down here because a couple of teams just had really good weeks and ended up jumping them. But even at that, although they did go 2-1 on the week, their 2 wins against San Jose and Anaheim are not necessarily the most impressive wins. Sure, Anaheim had a hot start to the season, but they are quickly coming back to earth. And they did lose to the one good team that they played, even if it was a close game, 2-1 to the LA Kings. Weirdly, this is a Panthers team that, at least so far anyway, has been winning their games in a very opposite way to how they did it last year, where last year they really relied on being able to outscore their problems defensively and in net, which they were able to do at least enough to make the playoffs anyway, and well, we know what happened from there. Whereas this season, they have been one of the best defensive teams in the NHL to this point, at least when it comes to expected goals against it, 5-on-5, and depending on where you look, they've actually been the best in the entire league when it comes to that specifically. Not to mention that they're getting at least above average goaltending from Bob, and it is that combination that's at least been able to keep them in games for an offense that has shown up from time to time at the very least. Jumping the Panthers though and moving up into that 7th spot all the way from being outside of the top 10 last week, I've got the Colorado Avalanche, who have announced their re-entrance into playing NHL games with 3 massive wins this week. Now the Avalanche did go through a bit of a tough stretch there, but this week came out with a 5-1 win, unfortunately in Seattle over the Kraken, and then an 8-2 win over the Ducks, and a 6-3 win over the Stars, who are still residing towards the top of this list. At least for now anyway. The Stars are definitely on the downward trend, while the Avalanche clearly are moving up this list, and in a quick way, the way that they've been playing, at least over these last 7 days. And really, I don't know what more there is to say about the Avalanche. We all knew that they had this in them. It's still one of, if not the most talented roster in the NHL. They just kind of went through a weird patch where Georgiev wasn't playing particularly well, and their offense completely disappeared out of nowhere. And just as quickly as it disappeared, it seems like it's come back in a big way, as well as Georgiev having a good week of his own. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, the only reason that I have them here at 7th and not farther up this list is because they did go through that cold patch and over the course of a couple weeks earned their way out of the top 10. So I didn't really want to move them all the way back up into the top 5, even if with the way they played this week and also the way some of the teams in the top 5 played it, it does seem that that's where they're destined to end up. And I do feel pretty good about saying that because with the Avalanche, unlike as we went over last week with some of those top 5 teams whose underlying numbers suggest that they've been overperforming how they've actually been playing, the Avalanche in almost every statistical category have been one of the best teams in the NHL. And I don't just mean one of the top 5 teams, I mean one of the best 1 or 2 teams the league has as far as how they've been playing, even if the results haven't necessarily always matched that. Though obviously they do still have to play the games, and as far as that's concerned, they've got 4 of them coming up this week, 3 against pretty manageable opponents, and underperforming to this point in Nashville, Minnesota, and Calgary, plus the one that could be a pretty big tell of where the 2 teams are at against Vancouver coming up on Wednesday. And then in the 6th spot, dropping out of the top 5, which is mostly due to how the team that jumped them into the 5th spot played rather than them playing poorly this week, I have the Dallas Stars. And I know Avalanche fans are going to get all up in arms because they're 1 spot below the Stars after having just beat them 6-3. But again, the Avalanche jumped from not being in this list to the 7th spot, while the Stars did drop pretty much because of that loss. Still, for the Stars, it is their first loss in over a week and a half, so they've been playing pretty well, and although it was a pretty bad one, again 6-3 at home for Dallas is not the way you want to lose a game, especially against a division rival who you're competing for the lead of the division with. They still have been picking up most of their points. Even if, yes, their only other game this week, which was a win, was an overtime win against Arizona, but again, Arizona isn't as bad as, well, at least I expected, and certainly not as bad as they were last year, to say the least. And yes, just 2 games this week is not a lot to go off of for the Stars, but it does seem like Ottinger is starting to fall back to earth a little bit after the incredible hot start to the season he had, and the offense has also cooled off a little bit after a bit of a hot streak there to at least get this team to above league average when it comes to their ability to score goals. It still isn't quite to that top 10 type of offense that I think a lot of people expected, but it at least hasn't gone back to scoring 1 or 2 goals per game. So with all of that, as well as this team kind of just hanging around the top third when it comes to all of the advanced and 5-on-5 stats, it will be an interesting team to watch over the next couple of weeks to see where they continue to trend into the middle of the season. I would be pretty surprised, honestly shocked, if they ended up anywhere near being outside the playoffs or even one of the wildcard spots for that matter, but they might also need to turn things around to keep up with the Avalanche if they continue to go the way that it looks like they're headed. Jumping the Stars, though, into that 5th spot and making it 3 teams from the Pacific in this top 5, which is incredibly annoying as a fan of another Pacific team who's not one of those 3. I have the LA Kings. Now, the Kings, too, played just 2 games this week, but they won both of them relatively decisively. I suppose the Florida game was a 2-1 win, so that was at least close. But then they went and absolutely stomped the St. Louis Blues 5-1. And quite honestly, with this Kings team, who again, I'm not a fan of, I mean, I don't hate them either, but I'm a fan of a different Pacific team, so obviously I'm not going to be the biggest Kings fan in the world, even outside of their boring jerseys. But that all aside, their 10-3-3 record might be actually underselling how good they've been to this point in the season. Obviously, I've already mentioned a couple of times, and will probably continue to do so for a little bit, that the weakness we thought for this team coming into the season in goaltending has been anything but, as Talbot has been one of the 10 best goaltenders in the NHL. But the biggest thing has been that at 5-on-5, this very well might be the best team in the NHL at even strength. Certainly, the advanced stats point to that, as they're the 2nd best team in expected goals against, and among the top 5 in expected goals for. And for that matter, a lot of that is panning out for them as well. And even though they have lost 6 games, almost all of their losses have been 1 or 2 goal losses. So they're not out of any game they're playing, and when they win, well, as we've seen this week, sometimes they do win big. In fact, of the 16 games that they've played to this point, they've only lost 1 of them by more than 2 goals, and they lost that one 5-2 to the Avalanche in their first game of the season. And even to put aside all of those advanced stats and the 5-on-5 metrics and all that stuff, when it comes to actual results, well, they're getting those too, as they're the 2nd best team in the NHL when it comes to goals for per game, and the 5th best when it comes to goals against per game. So they're getting the results, and they've got the advanced stats to back it up and suggest that it might not just be them lucking into those results in the first place. And as far as sustainability is concerned, well, they're getting these contributions from all up and down the lineup and not just relying on 1 or 2 hot players to carry them to where they're at. So this is a Kings team that could very well be challenging for a Pacific Division win if things continue to go the way that they have been over this last week for the 2 teams above them. And when I say above them, I don't just mean in the Pacific Division standings, I also mean in this power ranking, as right above them in the 4th spot, I have the Vancouver Canucks, who do end up losing 2 of the 3 games they played this week to Calgary and Seattle, 2 teams that have had shaky starts to their seasons, though at least Seattle hopefully seems to be coming back from that a little bit here. Either way, their 1 win also comes in overtime and required them to come back from a 3-1 deficit to beat the New York Islanders, who also have had a bit of a shaky last couple of weeks. Now, for the Canucks, it's certainly not panic time by any stretch of the imagination. After all, like I think I pointed out last week, this is a team that with the start of the season they had, could almost go 500 the rest of the way and still end up close to, if not in, a wildcard spot. That having been said, it does seem like there's a chance that the regression to the mean might have started for this team, and they might start getting some of the results in the standings that are closer to how they're actually playing their games. Which isn't to say that they've been playing poorly. If I thought they've been playing even as bad as the advanced stats seem to suggest they might have been, I probably wouldn't have kept them up in 4th after losing 2 games to struggling teams and barely winning a 3rd. But even still, I think it's worth mentioning at the very least that when it comes to the difference between what the advanced stats would project or expect for the Canucks versus what they've actually done, there is no team in the league even close to the Canucks at outperforming expectations. Now, on the defensive end, when it comes to goals against, a lot of that can be explained by the continued fantastic play of Thatcher Demko, but on the offensive end, where it's even more noticeable, there's no team even within a country mile of the Canucks when it comes to outperforming expectations. As when it comes to actual goals scored so far, the Canucks are still outscoring every other team in the league in goals for per game, but with expected goals, well, they've been outscoring their expected goals by almost 30 to this point in the season, which is 10 more than any other team in the league. I suppose for what it's worth, the next 3 teams below the Canucks on that list, even if they are significantly below the Canucks, are the 3 remaining teams that I have yet to get to on this list. So there's probably something to be said for these 4 teams, that they are probably creating some of their own luck here. But the amount that the Canucks are outscoring their expected is not all due to that self-created fortune. Or who knows, maybe it is, and the Canucks have figured out some way to defeat advanced stats and are just going to continue this the rest of the way through the season. I guess time will only tell, but for at least right now, the Canucks are still, well, maybe not this week, but have a good enough record to have the results to be a very much top 5 team in the NHL, at least for this moment in time. I will say though, as one last thing for the Canucks as a way to transition into the next team, if there is a cautionary tale for them for the potential end or regression to the mean of that offensive luck, it might be the team that I have in third in the Vegas Golden Knights, who happen to be that second luckiest team offensively even after how this week went for them, with 19 goals scored above what would be expected. But at least for the Golden Knights, it does seem that some of that offensive fortune dried up this week with only 9 goals across 4 games. And that's due in large part to getting shut out 3-0 twice to bookend the week, starting off with a 3-0 loss to the Capitals and finishing it off here tonight with a 3-0 loss to the Penguins. And at least for this week anyway, it wasn't just the offensive end of things that was concerning for the Golden Knights, as the one game that they did score a fair amount in, getting 6 goals against Montreal, they gave up 5 to keep that game close. And then their 4th game, they also lost in overtime, so they get at least 1 point out of it, losing 4-3 to the Philadelphia Flyers. And yes, I'm well aware that there will probably be some people that will take exception to me having a team third in the power rankings that just lost 3 of their 4 games over the course of a week. But for Vegas, that is half of their losses on the season so far through 19 games. They and the Kraken, the only teams to get to 19 by this point on Sunday. So they've played more than just about every other team and won 13 of them, and I probably even would have dropped them down to 4th had the Canucks not lost 2 games to Seattle and Calgary. That having been said though, it is the continuation of a troubling trend for Vegas here over the last couple of weeks, as they are now 2-4-1 over their last 7, and the goaltending from Hill and Thompson has started to also come back to earth a little bit. So it will be something to watch here over this next week or 2 weeks. If this trend continues, Vegas is going to continue to drop through these rankings, and who knows, like Colorado, they could end up out of the top 10 if this continues much longer. Although if that happens, unlike Colorado, I wouldn't mind if they stayed out of the top 10, but I wouldn't expect it. Moving on though to the team that I have in the second spot, who already last week there were people in the comments calling for this team to be ranked number 1, but I'm just not going to be able to do that as long as the Bruins continue to find ways to win games at the rate that they are, which by saying that I've given away who this probably is. Of course, it's the New York Rangers. Now the Rangers do just play the one game this week. They win it 5-3 over a Devils team that is struggling through some pretty key injuries. That having been said, the Rangers themselves are fighting through some key injuries of their own and still winning games. So there's a lot to like about how the Rangers are playing. There's just not a lot to take away from one win over the course of a week, other than they continue to play the way that they have been over the last few and continue to look like one of the absolute best teams in the NHL, even in spite of not having their leading defenseman and goaltender. And I suppose that it's extra impressive, missing those two in particular, that this is a team that's still giving up the second fewest goals per game of any team in the NHL. Of course, the team giving up fewer than them is the one above them, and another reason that I can't just move them up. But yeah, I really don't know what more there is to say about the Rangers that I didn't already say last week, again with them having just played that one game in the last 7 days. I suppose if there is one thing to maybe be concerned or look out for, I wouldn't say necessarily concerned with how the Rangers are playing, but something to look out for as a Rangers fan if you believe in all the advanced stats and that kind of stuff. It actually wouldn't be the defense. They're very much one of the best defensive teams in the NHL, which certainly helps out the goaltending while Shesterkin's out. It would actually be the offense, as the Rangers, like a couple of the other teams that I just mentioned, are definitely outperforming what would be expected of them based on how they're playing, and fairly significantly so. That having been said, they don't seem to have too much issue keeping the puck out of their own net, so even if the offense regresses a little bit, it still might not cost them a ton in the standings. Finally then, in that first spot, and the first time for me, at least in these power rankings, it hasn't been Vegas, it is the Boston Bruins, who continue to win games somehow, some way, which is pretty much their goaltending, as they are perfectly steady at giving up 2 goals per game. And I don't just mean averaging 2 goals per game, which they are, literally giving up 2 goals per game, winning both of their games this week by scores of 5-2 over Buffalo and 5-2 over Montreal. So scoring a lot of goals at the other end of the ice on top of it. For the Bruins, their record now of 13-1-2 is easily the best in the NHL. And while we continue to expect this team to not be able to perform as well as they have, well, they continue to prove us wrong. They did it all of last season, and who knows how deep they can keep this going this year. And I mean, for what it's worth, as much as I hate to say it, there is reason to believe statistically that they can keep this up, or at least close to this pace, for a good chunk of this season. as they are not only getting the production in real values on the ice every game, still having the best goaltending in the NHL from the combination of Swayman and Ullmark, giving up those 2 goals for per game, they are also scoring a good amount at the other end of the ice. And I don't just mean the actual goals, which have been, they win 5-2 in back-to-back games this week, but also expected-wise, while they are outscoring their expected by a decent margin, third most in that category, they're still expected to be scoring more than enough to get them wins, with their goaltending giving up just 2 goals in each game. I mean, I know I've been talking a lot about the advanced stats, but again, that's kind of where we're left with splitting hairs between these top teams. And when it comes to those advanced stats, of these 4 teams, the Bruins are easily the best of the 4, and certainly the most balanced between offense and defense when it comes to expected offense and defense at 5-on-5. Which is obviously where you spend most of the game. Of course, that does leave out special teams, but even when it comes to special teams, the Bruins don't leave any room for doubt there either, as they have the best penalty kill in the entire NHL, killing off 91.5% of their penalties to this point in the season, and their power play isn't too much worse at 10th best in the league. So yeah, this Bruins team is once again very, very annoyingly very good. Anyway, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below, who your top 10 teams would be, if there's especially any that I just left off of this entirely. The Flyers would be one that are starting to heat up again, which is kind of weird, but if they keep that up, they're going to at least be an honorable mention here in the near future. Even the Kraken have won a couple of games, though they're still quite a ways away from the top 10. Anyway, your thoughts down below, and until next time, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel and help you coming back to these power rankings week after week. Until that next time, though, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and thankfully we at least had some kind of mix-up at the top for once.